Afternoon, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. Now, imagine what you would do if you had clarity. So that's pretty much why we've created this web event series, full disclosure, so that you can get clarity on the topics that really matter to you as a firm. Now, like us, you've probably been a bit overwhelmed by the number of web events that have been happening over the last 18 months, some good, some not so good. And you've probably got bored with those pitch or content style webinars. Well, that's why we wanted to create something a little bit different. So this is a no holds barred, frank conversations on areas that really matter to you. So everything you wanted to ask about a topic, but were either too afraid to, because you might look stupid. Well, I'm happy to look stupid for you. So please pose the questions to me. I'm more than comfortable looking stupid. Or perhaps you just know that people weren't going to tell you the truth. So there was probably no point asking the question. So this is all about practical insights. It's about real facts, experiences, war stories, and quick wins as well, because those are helpful to share. So getting help on those topics that really matter. So I'm excited today to be joined by the legendary Jody Padar. Now, I suppose I could do the usual and say Jody is the vice president of BotKeeper, VP of strategy of BotKeeper. She worked in big firms. She's had her own firm. She's done amazing from that perspective. She's written God knows how many, 3-4 gazillion books and magazine articles for Forbes and Inc. and you name it, she's been there. She's been in the Accounting Today top 100 most influential accountants in the world, probably for, I don't know, last 9 years plus. So we could say all those things, or we could actually talk about what Jody's been doing, and she's absolutely made a massive impact on so many firms. She's radicalizing accountants around the world, pretty much in the US, but she's also doing it around the world. And her mission is basically to transition from the old school, old way of doing things and bringing in new, exciting ways of doing stuff. So Jody, I'm so excited to have you today and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the invite. And I'm just excited to be here as well. And not everybody knows this, but me and you met in Singapore. So we've actually had fun in person together. And it's really nice when you have professionals who, just agree on so many things. I can't tell you how exciting it is to, be on your show today and just be here with all of your people. So pretty exciting.
Fantastic. We both hate the status quo. We both hate rules, don't we? So that's why, yeah, that's probably why we get on so well together. So our social media handles are there. So please do follow us, do tweet, do post, whatever your social media area of favor is. Please do get in there and please do tweet and tweet along with us. And if you want to use the hashtag there as well, that would be fantastic. But do connect with us. We're happy to share. We both believe that the profession needs to be moved forward. We're both comfortable and happy sharing stories with the profession and making a massive difference, not just to the accounting profession, but to the clients of those accounting professionals as well. So please do hop on. Now we're going to jump out of slides because we're going to just have a fireside chat. And again, please do participate. Do jump in and put those questions in the Q&A. This is about me asking your questions, finding out from Jody more the practicality of how do we do this, because we've heard lots of theory and we've had some great speakers already on this event. So we've had Mark Wickersham talking about value pricing. We've had Ron Baker talking about value pricing. And it's going to be interesting really to hear from Jody as to how do you do it in practical terms? What are the challenges? What are the differences between the different types of pricing? Do you just go for one or do you use a combination? How does it work and how do you take those steps? But most importantly, it's about finding out what's the right price. How do you know it's the right price? And how do you make sure that you're doing it consistently and regularly across the whole firm, not just with 1 or 2 partners or with 1 or 2 departments? So Jody, I'm going to kill this share now so that we are in a proper fireside chat. I am on one screen, so I hope we're there. Yes, we are there.
Yes,
so that's
we are.
Good. An accountant with one screen today. It's awful, isn't it? Anyway. Let's get going. So we'll talk a little bit about Singapore in a bit, because there's some funny photographs of you that I want to talk about. But those were me showing you an implement that was some swag for clarity, but let's get to that at a later stage. So Jody, you worked from some really big firms in your time. You had been at some of the, some of the massive firms in the US. What made you join your dad's firm back in 2006? What was the catalyst behind that? Why did you make that decision?
Sure. So, I came out of school, went to PW, right? So it tells you how old I am, right? Kind of before the C. Um, and then I worked for a couple of mid-sized firms, and the mid-sized firms were like 7 partners, I'll say traditional mid-sized firms, old school mid-sized firms. And I was a young mother, and it just wasn't meeting my lifestyle, right? Like wanted to go, well, I shouldn't say I was part-time. When I started, I didn't have children. Then I had kids, and I wanted to work part-time, but I also wanted to be considered still a professional, right? And we found that I was like on the mommy track, and the partners, like, I mean, that was 20 years ago, right? So it was it was different, and I'd like to say it's completely changed now, though I would argue it hasn't. But anyways, so I wanted more, and I knew that I could do more, and so I jumped ship and I joined my dad. Now, my dad is a tax accountant. He was director of taxes and insurance for a publicly traded company, and he always had his side practice, which is very common in the US to have like a side business. And so, like, I mean, I really grew up in a tax firm, right? And I always knew that I would probably join him, but I didn't realize what that would look like. So I left this old school firm and I joined my dad. And my dad gave me the best advice ever, because here I thought I was going to start working on technical work. And my dad said, best advice ever, go find your own clients. You're not working on mine. So I had to learn how to build a business, right? And how many times do we step into the manager role, step into the partner role, and never have to actually sell accounting services? You just start going to do technical work. And so I actually had to learn how to acquire customers and kind of sell to customers and get people into this firm. Now, my dad's firm at that time was pretty small, and I grew it. Now, the other thing about it is those customers looked like me, acted like me, talked like me, and were young business owners at the time. So I was in my early 30s, right? So if you think about that, they went to technology first. We were using this thing called the internet. They didn't call it the cloud back then. And what happened is when I started to use this new technology, I realized that like the firm didn't work the same, right? Because you now had people being able to help you do your work, right? Because like the transactions were coming in and they could enter their own payroll and you just had to file the form. I mean, it was very disruptive to the way I learned how to do accounting work in my traditional firm. And so I had to kind of figure it out. And so in order to figure it out, Twitter was just starting. I went to Twitter because like that's what you did when you were right. And because if I went to the state society or I went to talk to other CPAs, they were doing everything the same as my other firm was. So they weren't very helpful in trying to figure it out. And so I went to Twitter and I found about 8 young professionals at the time who were doing everything that I was doing, except they were doing it in different areas of the country. And we were starting to chat with each other, and we were the early pioneers of what we would call today the cloud-based firm. So we were actually doing it and figuring it out as we went along. And we made lots of mistakes, but we also had each other to lean upon, to help each other, to kind of figure it out together. And that's really how I'll say the cloud accounting firm was born. Now, I don't want to say I take 100% credit for it, but we were actually in the weeds doing it, not necessarily talking about it. Whereas today, everyone talks about how to do it, et cetera. Well, 14 years ago, no one was talking about it. And that's why I was radical. And the thing about that was, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is 14 years ago when I was talking about these things that everyone talks about today, I was radical. I was blacklisted. Nobody wanted to hear from me. They all told me I was nuts. This was crazy. You could never do this. And guess what? We did it. We proved it. And, now everyone acts like they thought of it, but that's okay. We'll let them take it there. But to me, it's kind of cool to see where it's come, right? To say like we were just trying to figure it out, and now everybody's kind of trying to copy what we were really trying to figure out early 14 plus years ago.
Indeed. From an accounting practice perspective, so after the tech, what was the next areas that you needed to tackle? I mean, obviously getting customers, so we got there, but you got your customers, you're using technology. What areas of the firm were different to the old school firm that you really needed to get your head stuck into, first of all?
Well, so, and these kind of evolved as I kind of started, right? So I know like this show is about pricing, and I'm going to go here right away because my dad, remember, he told me to find my own clients. Well, I quit my firm in June. Well, guess what? Tax season isn't until the following January, February, right? And I had no money. So all of a sudden I had to figure out how to charge these clients ahead of the game so that I would have money to feed myself, right? So everyone talks about, necessity is the mother of invention. The reason I started pricing ahead, fixed pricing, value price, whatever you want to call it, I have my own term for it, but it was because there was a true business need and that I needed to start doing work with these clients so that I could get paid immediately and not wait till after tax season. So what I kind of came up with was this kind of check-in. Now this was as early cloud, so even some of these clients at the time were on desktop, right? But I would meet with them quarterly. I would update, make sure their books were solid. And I did advisory around it and I charged them for it. And what I did is I charged a monthly fee, which was 3 times as much as my old school huge firm was charging. I was adding more value. And I knew that they would be around for tax season because I bundled that kind of advisory work with a tax return. And then I started so they were prepaying it. And so then I started what we would call subscription pricing or monthly pricing or whatever, again, whatever you want to call it. And that was 14 years ago, even before the cloud, right? And it was 3 times as much as what my big school or my old school big firm was charging and for that work. And the reason I think my clients paid for it was because they wanted that everyday communication. And when I say every day, it means they had unlimited access, but nobody wants to call their accountant every day. Nobody actually calls every day, but they had an opportunity to call me if they needed. And then I absolutely kind of caught up their stuff and had an advisory conversation with them at least once a quarter. Now, some of them I did monthly, depending on what their needs were, but you couldn't come into my firm without being on this kind of this fixed price agreement with this advisory conversation and a tax return as well. And if you said, oh, I just want to do taxes, that's okay. Like, you're just not right for us. We can't serve you because I was tired of having a crazy tax season. And I knew that if we kind of gotten all their books straightened out before, that my tax season would be seamless. And as a young mother, I needed everything to just work, right? Like, I couldn't work 60 hours a week. It wasn't going to happen. So I had to make sure that our standardization, what we were serving, how we were serving it, kind of that productization of a service. Now, again, I'm using these fancy words now. When I was doing it, I was like, this is what I sell. This is how I sell it. And take it or leave it, right? Like, it wasn't like, oh, I'm selling a productized service offering. That came like later. In fact, when someone told me what I did was change a business model, I was like, oh, I just thought I was being an accountant. So, so it's funny because when you have to do these things and you figure it out, we figured out that everything had to be standardized, because if you don't standardize things, there's no way you can price them because everything's haphazard. And if you think about a traditional old school firm, you have 7 partners doing everything 7 different ways. Well, that's why these mid-sized firms are having a hard time switching their business model, because you can't get to any sort of solid pricing that's not by the hour unless you have standardization. And that's the biggest piece that everybody's missing.
Interesting. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Now, if we get on to the what types of customers were you dealing with, by the way? So you're charging 3 times what your old firm was charging. And I mean, can we give a kind of a rough comparison of what you were charging on a monthly basis for that kind of role?
So 14 years ago, my old firm was charging about $2,000 for a tax return. I was charging $6,000. And it basically was $500 a month. And it was, I always used to say, they buy the payment, not the car. So, and the difference was when tax season came, everything was clean and ready to go. So really what I was doing was building capacity, because I was doing work outside of tax season that in traditional firms, those clients who don't think they need advisory or don't necessarily come to you asking for advisory, come in March in the US with a messed up QuickBooks file, a messed up QBD file, and then they say, do a tax return on it. And in reality, the accountant has to spend 8 hours fixing the file before they can even do a tax return. Once the file's fixed, a tax return maybe takes a half hour to 45 minutes, but they spend all this time on the front end. And my thought was, well, gee, if I move all that 8 hours worth of work outside of tax season, when tax season comes, I only have to work an hour to get that return done. And I would be adding value to my customers because they would have the ability to talk to me all year, and I could do a little bit of tax planning and kind of just, be with them. And again, from my perspective, it was like, okay, how do I get these customers hooked so that by tax season, I know that they're going to come to me, right? Because again, I didn't have any revenue. So it was a way to, build revenue.
Cool. And it was a brave decision as well, wasn't it? To say, well, actually, if you just want a tax return, I'm not interested. I'm only looking for those that want extra help throughout the year.
Yeah. And part of it was because, again, if you think about where creativity comes from, I didn't have the opportunity to do all of those tax returns during tax season. I had a limited set of hours. And so I could only do so much tax work because, again, I wasn't going to work 65 hours. I didn't leave this old school firm to build a firm where I was going to work crazy hours. I wanted to make what they would call a lifestyle firm. But the funny thing is my lifestyle makes more than yours. So, and I say that kind of snide, but like everyone's like, oh, it's a lifestyle firm. Well, guess what? If I'm going home and still making the same amount of money, who's got the right lifestyle? So, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but it's a reality that people look down on me. They're like, what do you mean you're not working 60 hours during tax season? You should be. And I was like, why? Like, I don't want to work 60 hours during tax season.
Okay, so let's get into pricing, as this is pricing month.
Okay.
What do we call your pricing, or how did the pricing evolve? So we went straight into subscription pricing, or we went into this is your annual fee divided by 12, or however we want to call it. Yeah.
So I started with fixed pricing, and I didn't know it was called fixed pricing at the time. Basically, I came up with a number, like I pulled it out of the air, divided it by 12. And I was like, okay, it's working for me, right? And I knew that it was allowing me to make the money that I wanted to make and work the hours that I wanted to work. So that's kind of how I came up with it. It met my lifestyle and I was happy with it. After learning from Ron Baker and Ed Kless and all these pricing experts, I started to realize there was something actually that I was doing that there was like kind of theory behind and conversations behind. And I started to consume all the information that they were talking about. So, Ron and I are good friends now. Back then, he explained things to me. We talked about it. And so what I do when I ended my practice would be, I would say I did a fixed price with a value add. And that was on my kind of standardized pricing in engagements less than $25,000. And then I did what Ron Baker would call true value pricing in engagements over $25,000. And the reason I split them was because if you truly do value pricing really well, you have to spend a lot of time on the front end. And at a certain point, some of your customers aren't gonna they can't, I shouldn't, Ryan would say, well, you shouldn't put a price tag on what they can afford to pay or not pay. But in reality, if they're making less than $1 million gross or $500,000 gross, I don't care how much value you're delivering, there's a certain amount that they're only going to pay. Right. And so like for me, it was a way to kind of help these clients in a standardized and fixed way and still be able to charge for it, and then do value priced engagements where I was really kind of acting as that outsourced CFO, outsourced controller, and really kind of value price those engagements and, really do the due diligence that you need to do and really describe the value and sell the value on those bigger engagements. What I call a fixed price with a value add is I kind of have an idea of what the standardized costs are for all of those services and the standardized price. But when I talk to my customer, I give my customer kind of a PITA factor. So kind of that's the pain in the butt factor, right? So when you're starting to talk, you can tell a lot of times how that customer is going to be acting with you long term. So they would kind of get a rating. Whereas if I thought they were going to be a little bit difficult, they had to pay more. If I knew that they were easy, they paid a little bit less. If they were horrible, I said, no, we're not taking them, right? So I kind of gave a piece on their kind of personality, but then also based on where they were in their need for accounting services. So I kind of like, if they really needed something done fast, I would, I would charge a little bit more. Or if I really perceived that they were like so engaged with us, and like, I knew that if I raised my price more, like it wasn't going to kind of, it wasn't going to affect them either way. I would raise my price and they paid it. And every time I would raise it, I'd be like, they're paying it. And like kind of shocking myself, because like, I guess I didn't realize how much value I had expressed during the interview process, during the scoping process, when I was actually looking at their file and making kind of suggestions or recommendations. And again, now if you talk to someone would say, well, you have a consultative sales process. To me, I was just looking at their accounting work, kind of making some suggestions and putting a price on it, right? But if you actually study it, I do consultative sales, right? So again, it's so funny how you kind of fall into all these things, but like, who knew that they had terms for them, and that like I was actually doing things that, had been studied and people already knew how to do. And I just like kind of came to it through trial and error and making mistakes.
Well, isn't that where most innovation comes from? It's the ability to play and try and actually and make those mistakes and learn from them, especially learn from them, obviously.
Right.
Now, you mentioned Ron. So Ron was on actually last week and talking about value pricing. I gather you've got a long-standing bet with Ron. What do you want to tell us about that bet?
Sure. So maybe 5 years ago, Ron and I had a bet, because I believe that the profession and pricing is going to change in the next few years. And maybe it's because, mind you, I've been on this journey for 14 plus years, and I thought everyone was going to go to the cloud way back in 2010. So that tells you like how my perspective may not be. Right? I'm a little bit of a forward thinker, right? But my bet is that the profession would change in his lifetime, that we're going to flip pretty soon, and most firms are going to move towards some sort of fixed pricing, value pricing. They're going to get rid of the billable hour. It's not going to be really the way they price. And Ron doesn't believe it. He thinks that it's not going to happen in his lifetime. So I don't know how many years Ron has left. He's not that old. So I think there's probably at least 15 to 20 years left. And Ron does not think the profession is going to flip in his lifetime. So so that's where we are. And so we have a dollar standing bet, and I don't know what the qualifications are going to be, who's going to decide if it actually flipped or not. But when it flips, I'm going to get that dollar.
Well, according to him last week, it's already flipped. So I think you should call.
Well, maybe I need to follow up with him.
I certainly think you do. Now, we've talked a lot about value, and you explaining your value and that consultative sales process and how you express the value you can deliver. Lots of accountants out there are going to be saying, well, I don't, or maybe not saying it, but in reality, they just don't understand the value that they've got. They're, I suppose, not comfortable in the value that they're delivering. What do you say to those accountants?
So I think there's two things, and I think, and maybe I'm a little bit spoiled in the fact that I grew up in an accounting firm, and I'm listening to my dad be an advisor to his clients for the last 40 plus years, right? So I grew up hearing my dad having these conversations with his clients on the phone and adding value, because a lot of people say, oh, they're not advisors. And I would argue you are advisors. You just don't call it advisory, or you don't separate it from advisory. So that was the first thing, right? Is that I heard my dad have these conversations from the time I was a little girl. So I think that was kind of a step ahead. But I think it really becomes with kind of just getting solid in yourself, and to know that like you're good enough, right? Like if you have the experience to do a return, and you're good enough to charge that worth. And especially too, when I look at like these really big firms, and they put these young kids right out of school on these accounts, and they let them do this work, and it's not reviewed all that well, and it goes out the door, and they charge these crazy prices. And then you have professionals who have 20 plus years of experience, and they don't even want their prices to match what the big firms are charging, and those firms are charging it for someone, who has less than 2 years of experience. When you kind of start to see that, I think kind of something flips, and you're like, gee, my experience is really worth something, and I can explain things better. I can do all these other things, and therefore I should charge for it.
Cool. Do you think a lot of accountants have imposter syndrome, or they see themselves maybe as service workers rather than knowledge workers?
Um, I think so. I think part of that has to do with like the way old school firms train their young, right? So, you know, when do you really get to start having those advisory conversations? I know as a young professional, when I was in those old school firms, I did not have those conversations. I didn't have them until I was out on my own and I started to have them. So I think that, but then think about it. We didn't have the internet was around, but we didn't have the opportunity to learn how to do advisory from the internet. Like today, you have no excuse to say, well, I don't know how to do an advisory conversation, because there is training online, there are people online, you could talk to professionals. Anyone will teach you what advisory is and how to do it if you look for it. Whereas like when I was doing it, there was nowhere to find that professional advice. I was lucky I had my dad, but if you weren't like it, there just wasn't the community to learn from. And to me, and that's where I went to Twitter, right? But to me, that's what people have to get like used to. Like, you know, people go to YouTube to learn things. So like, if you don't have that knowledge today, don't undersell yourself. Just go find the knowledge and put it with your accounting skill, and then you just start selling it. It's not rocket science.
Cool. Now, a lot of people will be saying and watching, okay, so Jody, you started from scratch. So you had the ability to do it your way. That's a song, isn't it? You had the ability to do it your way from the very outset. What would you say to somebody who's coming into a firm where there are existing practices at play, where there are clients, you know, with
So
those practices? How do you change it?
So even though my dad had a very small firm, he had many he had old school customers who I was able to go through the transition. So I did have the experience of taking old school practice and changing it as well. So what I would say with that is first of all, start with your easy clients first. So if you come from a traditional practice or you have an established practice, you know you have clients who you get along with and who like listen to you, like never second guess you, like you have really great relationships. Those are the firms you start with first when you make the transition. And then you go to your medium size or like your medium relationships, I would say, and then leave your difficult clients till the end, because after you start to move your firm, at the end, if those difficult clients leave, you're like, go away anyways. Like you, because what happens is once you start to morph your firm, it becomes more difficult to serve the people who aren't on the new program than are. And so it's a lot easier to let them go. Whereas if I tell you to fire them all to start, you're going to be like, no, I need that revenue, blah, blah, blah. But as you start to move your firm, it becomes a lot easier to let them go. I would also say set a timeline. So don't let those other partners say, oh, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, and it never gets done. They have 6 months, 9 months, a year, whatever that timeline is, depending on the size of the firm, to morph your whole book of business. You can't let other partners say, oh, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. No, it's going to get done, and it's going to get done by a certain date. And if it's not done by that certain date, well, then I'm willing, and again, it all comes back to money. That's why people don't move. Then I'm willing to take that risk and say, look, I'm going to take my book, I'm going to break up. Again, it comes back to those partnership agreements, that as to why the profession as a whole doesn't move, because they're tied into their partnership agreements that are connected to money. And, you know, when money's sitting there, it's very hard to make people move.
Indeed. How important do you think it is to grade your clients before you start this process? So we've talked about you putting them into 3 brackets. I've heard you talk about personas in the past, and a lot of people think, well, personas really marketing, schmarketing speak. How important is that grading process and creating and identifying personas for your ideal clients?
So I think personas are really important, because personas help you kind of define your product offering and how you're going to sell it, how you're going to position it, how you're going to talk about it. So I think personas are important, but you know, if you have to pick up the phone and you're afraid to pick up the phone because you don't want to talk to that client, guess what? That client's an F client, and you need to kind of work them out of your firm. Now, some people say raise prices until they leave, and other people say, like, you know, just cut them. We had a really nice "you're fired" letter where it was always about us, not about them. And we didn't use it all the time. I mean, like, but we used it when we needed to. And one of the things that I always let my employees do was they had the right to fire any client they had the right to make that decision, and they just had to tell me about it. And if they wanted them gone, they were gone. And the funny thing is when I would hear them kind of talk and be upset about stuff that was happening, I would say, do you want to fire them? And they'd be like, oh no, it's just a bad day. So it's funny how, like, your employees, when you give them that leeway, they protect those clients as well, because they know, like, because it's so funny, because you would think they would want to get rid of them right away, but they were like, oh no, it's just a bad day, I'll continue to serve them. So I think it's kind of funny, because again, in our minds, we think like something's going to happen. In reality, the opposite happens.
Well, isn't it funny? Because we hire these qualified professionals, we pay them good money as qualified professionals, and then sometimes in our organization we don't treat them as qualified
Right.
knowledge worker professionals. Hey,
Right. And they surprise you.
they do. They do. Now, in our firm, we didn't get rid of them, the F's and E's. We graded them, and we didn't get rid of the E's and F's instantly. What we tended to do was, if we took on a really good client at A or B level, we would
Right.
get rid of the same value at the bottom, and was kind of like weeding
Right,
them
you
out.
kind of recycled them, kind of changed it. So, well, first of all, F clients, are friends and family, right? So they're the worst, and they sometimes never go away. So, but yeah, I mean, I think if you have a long time established practice, I think you really have to think about where you want to serve people. We eventually got rid of our 1040s that were not connected to businesses. It was a long time coming, but it was okay, because I feel like we did it as a chunk, and we kind of we helped them find new preparers and stuff like that. And I think as long as you're upfront with your client base and expectations, like, they're going to react to you. They get it. Well, not all 1040s, but many of them are business owners themselves, and they kind of get it too. So I think, again, it's we put our beliefs on other people, and we forget that other people have different perspectives, right? Like, I think we think that what we think is what they think, and it's so not true.
Absolutely. I mean, Firm of the Future that Paul has just joined in the background, by the way, and I'm not sure if people can see him, but he's come in as a panelist, so he's got extra special rights, and he's just listening in the background. But interesting, Paul and Ron Baker wrote Firm of the Future, and in that book they talk about Boeing, a Boeing 7, I think it was a jumbo at the time, so that's 747 or 777, I'm not sure. And they talk about the allocation of seats on that plane when an airline starts to sell those tickets, and they allocate, between 8 and 15% to first class. They kind of go 15 to 20, 25 on business, and then they have full paying coach, you call it in the US, but we call it, just those tourist seats or whatever. And then there's a allocation for lower price seats, and then for those bucket discount fares and for bereavement fares. Now, it's interesting, in an airline, once they start releasing those seats, they hold seats back at the top of the plane and at the most expensive end of the plane. And unless we get towards the end of that flight, there is zero, they create zero capacity for discount fares, yet they always have capacity for their better clients. Mm-hmm. In an accounting firm, if we look at it, it's often the other way, isn't it? Where most firms release capacity for their D's, E's, and F's, and they don't have enough capacity for their A's to B's. How do we make sure, why do accountants do that, first of all? And how do we make sure, what do you say to those people to say, stop it, just don't do that anymore?
Well, so I think, first of all, it's very hard to conceptualize that when you're trying to make money to feed your family. It's really easy to say, okay, like, we're going to leave space open, but yet, you need to take home so much to pay your rent, mortgage, whatever, right? So, like, again, it's kind of like this great theory, but in reality, I know if I leave that capacity open and it doesn't fill that month, then, like, guess what? I didn't make the money that I need to make to cover my rent, right? Now, I think that it's great in theory, but I think in reality it's very hard. However, I would argue today technology gives you the opportunity to build capacity very quickly. So I think it's different today in that you can free up a lot of that with with more technology. And in fact, even before artificial intelligence, machine learning, that's what we were doing because we were using cloud technology. And all of a sudden, we had kind of shifted the workload because the computer was doing a lot of the work that we used to do by hand. So we actually had more capacity, right? So I think that that's a reality. But I also believe that you have to have a good enough pipeline. You have to have a strong enough sales component that, as my grandma would say, if one bus right, if one bus goes, you'll catch the next one, right? So like she used to say that about dating. If if one guy moves along, you'll catch the next guy, right? Well, it's the same thing with, you have to have a strong enough pipeline so that that you have leads coming in, whether it be 1 a week, 2 a week, whatever you need to do to make sure that you have the ability to fill that capacity that you leave open for space for, right? So again, it's so funny because everyone's like, oh, it's pricing and it's practice management and it's sales and it's all of these things that old school firms never thought about, right? Because, and especially ad technology, you can have online sales coming in, right? Like you can really build that online presence. You can build your brand. That stuff, when I was in my old school firm, it didn't exist. Like there was firms barely had websites. So they didn't have the ability to do like kind of this online sales through like marketing and stuff, or content marketing, whatever, right? Like everything was referral based. You had to serve the people in your town or near you. You didn't have the whole world as your customer base. All of these things that we have today that make it so much easier to do what I did 14 years ago. And if you need inspiration, I did it 14 years ago with no support, no help. I figured it out on my own. And I mean, I'm a smart cookie, but I'm not that smart. So like, I think the average person can figure these things out. It's just about looking at things from a different perspective and not taking everything that you were trained in the past to do over and over again.
Cool. So everything we've talked about now with value pricing has been about, I suppose, pretty much about the advisory services. What do you say to those firms out there that are just doing compliance only? Is value pricing out of their range, or are there other things that they can do from a pricing perspective?
So I think, first of all, that's where I would argue it's not compliance only. Nothing is compliance because you have to do a little bit advisory to do compliance anyway. So you just call it compliance, right? So anyone who does any bit of tax planning, like guess what? Tax planning is advisory, right? And I think firms hurt themselves because they say, oh, I'm just compliance. And yet, are you the person that compliance person calls when they have a problem? Well, guess what? That's advisory. Right? They look to you for something, right? So I do what we call, or like I've coined this term called advisory light, where you're not doing this in-depth like data analysis, blah, blah, blah. It's basically, I help my small business owners do something. And I always say I'm one Google ahead of them, right? So they call me and they're asking for some sort of help around something in their business, and I help them figure it out, right? And so to me, that's advisory light. And quite honestly, you don't have to have hundreds of years of experience to do what I call advisory light. You could have your youngest team members in your firm answering those questions, and chances are they already do. It's just you never called it advisory. You just said, oh, I picked up the phone and I answered the question for my client. Or your client called because they complained for an hour about their office manager, and you just sat there with the phone, and the client talked themselves through whatever they needed to do, right? I call that advisory light. Now, if you talk about CFO advisory, that's something completely different. But most people who are doing compliance are already doing advisory light. They just don't call it that.
So they're leaving money on the table.
They're leaving money on the table, 100%. And I would argue, you don't even have to call it advisory light. Just raise your prices, right? Like just raise your prices. And put that value in for the perspective. And if your clients say, well, why are you raising your prices, or what's happening? Just say, look, we're increasing our prices. We know that we offer you more value on a day-to-day basis, and we need to raise our prices. And we'd like to walk you through kind of that value prop of the calls we can answer, the types of things we do. And at the end, yeah, you get a deliverable, but we know that you depend on us. And we had the biggest, like with PPP, I don't know what you had in the, overseas, but we had like these government things. We were never more valuable to our clients, and they all called us about it. And unfortunately, too many firms didn't even charge separate for that advice because they thought that it was like they felt bad or they were giving it away or whatever. And if we're coming off of that expression. So again, if you're raising your prices and people say, well, why are you raising your prices? And I would say, well, do you remember when PPP was here last year and we helped you through it? Guess what? That was an advisory service, and we want to be able to deliver on those kinds of services for you all the time. And because of that, we need to raise our prices.
Interesting, because Sharon Pocock, I'm not sure if you know Sharon, she's known in the UK quite a bit. She's been kind of early adopter of Zero and cloud technology. She said that she went to so much trouble for her clients during the difficult times, and people forget really quickly. And then when you start wanting to increase prices at a time when they're saying, well, hang on a sec, you did it free last time, so why aren't you doing it free now? So,
right. Well, that's when you say, well, I did it free. No, like that's why I'm raising my prices.
Indeed. Now people are going to say, well, okay, cool. So Jody, you're a switched on character. So you're able to have this conversation with clients. You've got the experience, you've got the nous, you've got the know-how to be able to deal and handle with it, and the experience of, being on the front line all the time and people saying, oh, that sounds a bit expensive, or, oh, I would like to do a little bit more with you. So how do we get the team involved? How do we get the team looking at charging the right price all the time?
So the most important part about pricing, and you could talk about value pricing, whatever, fixed pricing. The most important part about pricing is scope. I don't care what you price. If your scope is wrong, you're going to lose money. And I think we forget to talk about scope, right? And that's why I think we titled this Pricing and Scoping, because scope is so important. And you need to make sure your team knows what the deliverables are, what they should be doing with them, and how they need to be delivering them based on your firm and what's important to your firm, right? And if your team doesn't understand where scope begins and where scopes end, you'll lose your shirt. And accountants by nature are going to spend an extra 2 hours looking for that penny. So you better explain to them where things begin and where things end and what needs to happen. And this is, I think, the hardest part, or the people who say, well, I'm not getting rid of my timesheet. If you don't get rid of your timesheet, and I don't want to have that argument, but if you don't get rid of your timesheet, it becomes a crutch and you don't manage correctly. And what needs to happen is accountants have to get a lot better managing on the front end, setting expectations with their clients, setting expectations with their team, having their teams understand truly where their value is, what they deliver, how to get the deliverable out the door, and give your team the ability to step back from the client and say, hey, client, I love you. We can totally do this service, but this is outside of the scope of our regular engagement. Let me have Jody get on the phone with you and put a price around it, or let me take it to whoever and they'll help you figure out the price. And that's how you teach your team how to harvest work, because they're the ones who are closest to it, and they're going to be the ones who find out what the clients really need. And in traditional firms, they already do it. It's just, it goes through the timesheet, and then either the partner decides they're going to write it off or they're going to charge for it. And if they charge for it and the client calls back and says, hey, I didn't want that, and then the partner writes it off or leaves a bad feeling on the, so it's already happening in firms today. We just don't acknowledge it. We don't talk about it. But what we need to do is we need to get way better on the front end, helping our teams understand what scope is, helping them get that confidence to harvest the work. And then if they do it, you reward them. Because guess what? If you reward them for finding work and for it, you're building their sales muscle, right? Like that's how you learn how to be a consultative salesperson. Now, some of them may never want to actually go out and sell, but every one of your seniors, every one of your managers should have a harvesting component in them. If they can't harvest work, then they're not really good, because in order to be really good at your job, you have to be able to see what your small business owner doesn't see. And if you can't see it, then I would argue you need to train them better. You need to help them understand that what it means to be consultative and what it means to be advisory. And catch them up, right? Teach them how to harvest things. And this idea of harvesting, the AICPA has like training courses on it. It's not anything new. It's just we don't talk about it. We don't acknowledge it. I don't know why. We always talk technical and nobody ever talks about like what it really means to be a full professional and how you get that senior manager up to being a partner. Because if you don't teach them how to harvest work, they're never going to get to a consultative sale.
This is a lot about training and communication, isn't it? I mean, it's the communication issue is possibly the challenge for many accountants, from a sales perspective, from a management perspective. And
Right.
you know, a good friend of ours said once that it's, you know, in advance is an explanation, in arrears is an excuse, and that works, I suppose, both from a client perspective and also from the team perspective too. So good insights. Thank you very much for that. Now, when we get onto these timesheets, a lot of people say, well, okay, so we're accountants and costs are really important. We need to manage and control our costs. We need to know where our team are spending time with our clients. Whether we put a price on their time and record it on the timesheet to bill, we still need timesheets to be able to track who they're doing work on for which client and where they're spending their time. What do you say to those people who defend timesheets on the basis of cost analysis?
Do you know who your good employees are? Without looking at a timesheet. Yep, you already know. So I think that costs become irrelevant because if you really manage scope really well, it doesn't matter because you've already built it into your price and your team is a fixed cost anyways. And your team will tell you when they need more capacity, right? And so it really starts to managing inputs and not time as being that input, right? So instead of managing time, you're managing your team, you're managing your technology, you're managing all the other things that build capacity in your firm, and time becomes irrelevant. Because I honestly, when you enter into a relationship, a true relationship, and that's what these relationships become, because it's not once a year. When you enter into that relationship, do you put a dollar value on the time you spend with your husband or with your wife? Right? Is it like if you only spend 15 minutes with them, is that any different than spending 3 hours? If your husband or wife needs that time at that time, right? Or your kids, use your kids as an example, right? Like they need what they need when they need it. And it's not about you spending a ton of time on something. It's about your team understanding scope and deliverables and what customer service or what customer success means to your firm. Now, so for some firms, it may be never spend more than 15 minutes on a phone call. I don't know. That's not my idea of it, but some firms may think that's important. And so then they would measure that. But for me, like if your business owner needs an hour to just vent, I'm there for that hour. And you know what? You can't put a price on it because when they come to renew your subscription, they're not going to put a price on it. And if you raise your rates, guess what? They're not going to put a price on it again. They're going to be like, oh my God, I talked to Jody and she solved my problem. And in reality, they solved it themselves, right? So those are the intangibles that timesheets don't measure. And everyone says, oh, well, you could put that in the description. Oh, whatever. It's not about the description. It isn't going to matter. And you need to trust your employees. And I think the pandemic kind of exemplified it as well, right? Like, you know who your good employees are and you know who aren't. And then you can decide how long you're willing to carry those not so good employees based on the work you have to do, the capacity you have to do. I mean, like, again, then it just becomes a business decision. It's not a timesheet. And some people still want to keep timesheets. They want to make it feel like once you start managing differently, like you'll realize you don't need them. And every other business manages without timesheets. Why accountants feel they can't is beyond me.
What KPIs did you have in your firm? So a lot of people ask, okay, so we get rid of timesheets. What KPIs do we put in their place? What KPIs did you have?
So I really looked at like my P&L, and then we did it kind of squishy, right? It probably wasn't the most data-driven KPI, but we would just review our client list every 6 months or so and be like, who needs more, who needs less, where do we need to adjust things, right? Now, mind you, we had like my firm at the end, we only had 60 clients. We did about 300 returns, but one of the clients was a large client, and my firm was grossing 650 a year, and we had 2.5 full-time equivalents. So when you look at kind of the per full-time equivalent value, that was really my number. And I believe if you use automation even better than I did, because the automation is just getting better and better, that you could get to $1 million gross per full-time equivalent. To me, that's like the hallmark. If you could get to $1 million per FTE, that would be awesome. And so 650 at 2.5, I think I could have gotten there better, but I decided that it wasn't what I wanted to do anymore.
Well, that's cool, because don't the big four, isn't their revenue per employee about $150,000? So we're going from 150 up to 1 million. That's pretty nice revenue per employee.
And so one other thing is, I talked to another firm, and so for our size firm, there was a business owner. She has 8 employees. Now some of them are part-time. We had 2.5, and she had 8. Talk about managing. Like, guess what? If you only have 2.5, it's a lot easier to manage 2.5 people than it is to manage 8. So think of that headache that you just got rid of as well.
Indeed. And where do you see AI taking all this? So we've talked about automation. So where do you see AI really pushing the boundaries on I suppose revenue per employee and other things as well?
So automation and AI just get rid of the grunt work. So if you think about the ability to, instead of looking at 400 transactions, the ability to look at 5 transactions, because 395 of them were automatically coded. Like, how much less time is that going to take you, right? And again, that's where time really becomes irrelevant, because how do you bill a nanosecond? And like, you can't bill a nanosecond. It doesn't work. And that even happened with the cloud. I always used to say, how do you build 2 minutes? Well, now how do you build a nanosecond? You don't. You have to figure out a different way to price. So.
Cool. So we've had a couple of questions come in, so we've got time, and please do drop in the questions. People have been very quiet today. I think, again, like Ron, people are absorbed, so they're into the conversation and forgetting to ask the questions, and maybe I'm reading the next question already, but we have had a few. So how do you deal with scope creep? And like lots of firms, they're afraid possibly to have, I'm probably answering a question for you, but one person saying absorbed and stunned. Yes, the £1 million revenue per employee would be, or $1 million would be a nice one to get to. So this is scope creep, right? That's great. So we get scoping when it's happening. But then during the year, some clients don't have some services, and then the team maybe substitutes something else for it. And then it goes a little bit out of control, and then it's gone too far down the road and they can't stop it. How do you deal with scope creep?
It's about your team. Your team has to understand scope so well. Again, it goes down to scope. Like, your team has to know scope, and they have to be willing to tell you what scope is, like where things are in scope, where they're out of scope, what's happening. And again, I think that just becomes a lot more transparent when you help them. And if you explain to them how you price and they understand pricing, because in old school firm, pricing is like this big secret that partners talk about, nobody actually talks about, right? I didn't even know what my rate was as an employee. I was not allowed to know that, right? So so you have to get transparent. You have to tell your team, and you have the ability, again, to compensate them on those things, right? So if they stay in scope, compensate them, right? Or figure that out. And again, it goes back to training and making sure your team knows what it is you're selling and how you sell it, what the deliverables are, and giving them the opportunity to harvest more work and to do that. And I'll say, with all of my clients, I would always come up with a price in my head, and then I would talk to my team and I'd be like, what do you think? And they would tell me to raise the price, because they always know that, it really takes longer than the partner thinks. So they would automatically raise the price. And then once they gave me a price, we just added 20%. So again, some of these numbers, it's like, okay, like, let's just pull them out. But that 20% to me was the fudge factor. It was like, okay, like, I have fudge factor in here and I'm good. It's good enough for me. So again, that's not this great science of pricing, But in reality, what happens is the more you do it, the stronger you get at it, the more you understand. When you start, putting these personas around clients, they all have very similar behaviors, and you know what the expectations are. I mean, you might not think a graphic artist is the same, but my God, if you do 15 graphic artists, you know exactly what it takes to do a graphic artist tax return. And I'll tell you this, it's not in the tax work, it's in the explanation, because for whatever reason, graphic artists don't get taxed. Like, don't understand it, so you spend a lot of time explaining. And so, like, again, those personalities are fine, but if you know that that's what it takes, then guess what, you can build it into your pricing, and guess what, your team knows how to have those conversations because they're all alike. And again, I know they're not all totally alike, but they're alike enough that they know how to have those conversations. And then again, if you're doing something repetitively, you know what's in scope and what's out of scope because you're doing it so often. So that's, I think, one of the things with niches that people don't talk about is the whole idea of a niche and the standardization is it's a lot easier to stay in scope because it's very repetitive. Whereas if you're kind of all over the place with different types of clients and whatever, it's harder to know kind of what the everyday expectation is for that type of client, or what's important to them. Whereas when you start niching out, it's easier to figure that out.
Cool. We have one question from Susan, which is, how did you outline the scope to your client? Was this, I presume we're asking the practicalities, was it in an engagement letter? Was it in an attachment?
So,
how did you outline the scope?
So before I did scope, so they came into the sales meeting or the meeting with prior year 2 years of tax returns, 2 to 3 years of tax returns, and I had access to their QBO file or zero file. I did not have any conversations until I had a clear understanding of what I was looking at. Then I set my price, and I kind of figured out what my pricing would be after I shouldn't say that. Then I talked to the client, we had a conversation. Then after doing that conversation and kind of putting all those things together, then I kind of set my price. And at that point, because you've already had some conversations with the client and you've been able to express value, and if it's a $6,000 client, it might be, 2 hours worth of work, an hour of a conversation, and an hour of scope. If it's a $25,000 engagement, absolutely, you're probably going to spend 4 to 6 hours on scoping, right? So, like, remember, like, the size of the engagement is going to dependent. But then when you have that conversation, you just explain to them how your firm works and the value that you're going to deliver. And if you've done your job right and scoping, you found something that you can point out to them that even if they already knew it, they're like, oh my God, how did you know that? Because I read numbers, like numbers tell stories, right? So even if you're not offering them tax savings, you're not doing anything else, if you can tell them one little thing about their business that you just know because you read numbers that they think is like this brilliant idea, all of a sudden they're going to be like, you understand me, you understand my business, sign right here.
Perfect. Telling better stories with numbers. Accountants are great at telling stories with numbers. They possibly don't realize it, but absolutely, 100%. I've got another question for you. What's the most radical thing you've done this year, Jody?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I'm kind of getting old in my radicalness. So here's the thing, like, when I first started, I was really, really radical in like everything that I did, and everything was so disruptive. And now I've kind of bored myself, right? So I have to think of what that next radical thing is. I mean, I could say it's like utilizing more technology, but I don't even think that's all that radical anymore. So I got to really figure out kind of what that next level radical is, because the more we talk about it, and this is what I've always wanted when I kind of started this movement to really help the profession move forward, was to get everybody on board. But now that you have kind of the masses moving, it's kind of, I don't want to say boring, but like I kind of got to get out there and figure out what the next thing is and to pioneer it, because, I got to keep up my game. So.
Awesome. Well, Jody, thank you so much for today. It's been really insightful. I think the very interesting numbers that you brought to play and some really cool practical experience. Awesome. Well, Jody, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And hope you've given some amazing insight. And of course, the recording will be amplified, and we will make sure your message goes out as much as possible. We believe in radicalization too. So good job. Thanks, Jody.
Great. Thank you.